Hi, this is Phil Parker, and this is podcast number 16, in which we look at yet another of the great themes that underpin narrative. In this one, we're talking about the fear of death, which is linked with another, which is the fear of the unknown, and these two form the basis of most horror narratives globally. But let's define them slightly at the beginning of this discussion, in the sense that the fear of death is not what most people assume, which is this idea that people are afraid to die. Obviously, the majority of human beings actually really do fear the fact that they will die. But this is not what the narrative actually confronts. Well, the narratives dealing with the fear of death confront the fact that life ends for one person or perhaps a group, but the world goes on. And it's this sense that when your life ends, other people's lives don't, and things are left undone, unsaid, unresolved. And perhaps you have this sense that, well, something should have been done about that. Whereas the fear of the unknown comes from a totally different area, which we'll deal with in the next podcast, which is those things outside us that cannot be known. And out of that great unknown comes things that we have no control over. Now, the confusion gets more difficult, of course, when we actually start to watch movies or watch TV series, or even in some cases, watch the odd podcast. Because people will say, well, ghost is an unknown thing, or spirit is an unknown thing, and where's the line? Well, this is, of course, why they're all in the horror genre. But there is a very clear line here to be drawn. Ghosts that come along as spirits that are rampaging around and express, some sense of just wanton destruction, with no backstory and no actual connection to the place or the people they're dealing with. This is about the fear of the unknown. What we're talking about in this podcast is very much about known entities, normally expressed as ghosts. In some cultures, this would be seen as spirits or poltergeists, or in fact, some demon in some cases. But in reality, it's this idea that a human being or some being has died, and in their death, they left something unresolved. And that spirit that they had with them at the point of death seeks to come back into our everyday world. And in that context, actually somehow bring about some resolution. Now, this is a classic scenario from a narrative construction point of view, and it's very easy to spot. Because in essence, what happens is you have an everyday world established, and then into that comes a ghost, a spirit, something that doesn't belong there but belongs of that place. And more often than not, these things are very specific to place. Sometimes the central protagonist has to track down where that place is to discover the body. Sometimes it's very much about discovering who put that body there, and that is the essence of what goes on. But place for ghosts is very important. But far more important is the relationship with the life they left behind. And it's this that the fear of death really confronts so well. It's this desire in human beings to have some resolution in their life. The fact that, either their great romance was fulfilled, or that the injustice that they suffered is finally sorted out, which of course the ultimate being is that they were murdered or someone close to them was murdered. But in some cases, it's about displacement. It's about a lack of respect. You find many poltergeist stories actually hinge around the fact that, a graveyard's been disturbed or a sacred place has been overturned. And this happens a lot in Southeast Asian movies, and to some extent in the Hong Kong movies as well, expressing the sort of Chinese relationship with the afterlife. So in these worlds, the ghost really is a connection between the past and the present. And the essence of the fear is that you will live a life and you will not end up feeling at the end of it, when you leave it, that actually the big thing that needed to be sorted out for you has been addressed. And you will come back to haunt those that remain, or in fact, a complete innocent. Now let's take a couple of examples of this, just so that we've got a clear idea of what we're talking about. One of the most obvious ones is The Devil's Backbone, this very successful Spanish film of a few years ago, in which, in essence, middle of the Civil War, children find themselves in an old orphanage, and one of them is being haunted by a small boy who in fact was killed. And so by the end of the film, not only has he resolved who this child that's haunting him is, but has actually come to deal with the very nature of the abuse that child suffered. And it's a really classic ghost story, but it's also classically about this nature of the fear of death leaving something unresolved. Obviously, in American cinema, the big breakthrough film that did this not a while ago was The Sixth Sense, which took everyone by surprise at the time because not many true full-on ghost stories have been made in American cinema up to that point for some time. In the more recent times, the Japanese have brought forward a whole series of new ghost stories, the most famous of which now is Ringu, which was remade. Now, this is an interesting one because here, the ghost, the spirit of the woman murdered and dumped in a well, basically refuses to lie down. The sense of anger is so manifest that even though they try to resolve it, i.e. the people who discover this is what it's all about ultimately, they cannot find a solution to this unquieted spirit. Now, this is actually taking the ghost to another level, but still undoubtedly dealing with the idea that this fear of death is what's driving them. At the point of death, when they were murdered, they were so angry at the world that essentially their spirit will never rest. Now, in a more poignant manner, you have something like The Orphanage. And here, very simple story, a mother's loss and of a child and trying to get it back. Now here, death is present from the very beginning of the film, and the ghosts haunt this woman to the point where she can seek resolution by uncovering why they're there. A much more difficult one to position is something like Field of Dreams, where all these ghosts walk out of a wheat field to relive a moment in history. And you're looking at it and going, what is this fundamentally about? Is this actually a ghost story in the sense that it's about the fear of death? Or is it actually more about the nature of validation? I think if you look more deeply into the piece, you'll realise that actually all of these people wanted validation. And that actually this was a personal drama, not driven by the theme of validation we talked about in the last podcast, and not a piece of work that was actually driven by the fear of death, which therefore one can see that ghosts can be used in other genres and actually reflect in their usage another theme. But that's because they're used differently. For the vast bulk of ghosts, it is that fact that we die, we leave things unresolved, and we look to narratives that are actually in some way going to express our fear of that.